Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another in our series of NRL live streaming sessions and radio shows. Every other week on Wednesdays at this same time, we will discuss a new topic and want to encourage you to provide as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. You can call or text us at 1 844 424 0500. That's 1 844 424 0500. And if you have a music request, you can also call or text us, but you also have to give us a question or provide a comment about the project at the same time. So we look forward to hearing from you today. And just to remind everyone, we're doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public get a better understanding of what's involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and encourage viewers and listeners to participate in both of these activities. With me today is my usual co-host, Qasim Sadiq, who is the project co-lead for the Northern Road Link project. Good afternoon, Qasim. You've had a busy day, I take it?
Good afternoon, Don. Yeah, a little bit of running around here and there. Nothing that's not a usual day, but it's starting to. It was looking like spring yesterday. Very different this afternoon, but I've heard it's snowing quite a bit in northern Ontario. So we'll take the freezing rain only.
I agree with you, Qasim. Well, I'm quite happy with the way it is now, even though we're going from, I think it was minus 18 Celsius in Toronto with the wind chill on Monday night to, I think, possibly positive 16 tomorrow afternoon. So, anyhow, I guess that's March, isn't it, Qasim?
It just is. Those daffodils and tulips are on their way.
Yes, they are. That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So, in today's session, which we're calling Environmental Assessment Proposed Terms of Reference, Part 1, we're going to discuss the components of the proposed tour, or at least some of the components, with the others being discussed in our next show, because there are many components and we just can't possibly get through all of them even in an hour. So, Qasim, without further ado, let's get started. Maybe you can do a quick run through of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely, Don. Let's start with what we're discussing this afternoon. So we'll go back and talk about where we are in the provincial tour process. So we'll discuss that flow chart, the process flow chart once again. So switching gears this week to talk more about the provincial process as opposed to the federal process that we've talked about for the past few weeks. Then we talk about, what is the proposed tour? Again, just a reminder. Then the third one is components of a proposed tour. You'll recall in the past the language around the tour was a draft tour. So the word changed and will describe what the word proposed tour now means for us in the project. So in today's session, we'll talk about sort of the introduction sections of the proposed tour, description of and rationale for alternatives, which is another section, and then we'll talk about the section called description of the project. And of course, as always, lastly, leave you with our follow-up contact information if anyone is interested in following up with us.
Thanks, Qasim. And maybe let's start now with a high-level review of sort of where we are in the tour process. Uh, we started with the notice of commencement of the terms of reference back in May of 2021. And then we worked diligently to put together the draft tour. The draft tour was issued for review and in the fall, I believe it was, and early November, I think it was, and comments were received. And we've been very busy responding to those comments and incorporating feedback related to those comments in our tour. And we are almost at the point, Qasim, of well, we're almost finalizing the tour, but we don't know the exact date it will be released yet, do we?
Well, we don't have the exact date today, but I think at the next session in 2 weeks, Don, we would have exactly landed on that exact date. So we're just a few weeks out, ladies and gentlemen. We're probably about somewhere between 4 to 5 weeks out, roughly. So it is imminent, but we'll talk about that exact date at the next show. So something to come back for, I think, Don.
That's right, Qasim. And once that proposed tour is finalized, it then goes to the minister for a decision, where it will either be accepted or accepted with changes or rejected. So that's the basic path forward, and that shows you where we are currently in the process. Qasim, why don't we uh, look at the contents of the proposed tour next by just sort of going. Oh, actually, no, sorry. Why don't we step back a little bit further and just go through what the proposed tour actually is, if you don't mind doing that.
I think that's a good place to start on. So, what exactly is the proposed tour? As our audience would recall, the environmental assessment terms of reference, or the TOR, as we call it, it's the work plan for the environmental assessment, which is the main event, really, but it follows after the terms of reference process is complete, and that's the terminology in the provincial process. So we're doing a provincial environmental assessment. We're doing the federal process as well, at least the initial phases, as we've talked about in the past. But the language there is different. That's called the impact assessment. Um, and the current phase that we're in, it the word proposed tour basically is a revised version of the draft tour. So we had a draft tour which was released back in November for comments from neighboring indigenous communities, from the public, from various government ministries, and we received all of those comments, and then based on that input and feedback that we get from all the different indigenous communities, neighboring communities, members of the general public, different ministries and regulators, we make those changes to the work plan, to the tour. And that really does help improve the overall quality of the product and effectively the project as well. But we're not done. So that level of change, all of those changes, once incorporated into the draft tour, uh, they get developed into a new product, which is now called, just to be able to differentiate between the two, we now call it the proposed tour. And that proposed store then gets submitted again to the Ministry of Environment in Ontario. And then the MECP, which is the regulator for the environmental assessment process, the Ministry of Environment in Ontario, makes the proposed store available for a formal review period and comment. So if anyone hasn't had a chance, or even if you've had a chance to comment on the draft, or all the more reason, I guess, to review the proposed store once it becomes available. And during and after the prescribed review and comment period, we will respond to comments and incorporate that feedback. Then we submit that feedback back on the proposed store to MECP for the minister's decision. Um, and the minister can either accept the proposed store, the minister can accept with changes or amendments, or the minister can reject the proposed store as well. But it's a really interesting couple of weeks, Don, in which the proposed store is released. It's now under the purview of the regulator MECP. Comments still come in. People have a brand new opportunity, or another opportunity to look at the proposed store, provide comments, we get the opportunity to respond back. And once those changes are incorporated, and the final version sort of emerges based on those responses, and that goes to the minister for the decision. So a lot of feedback built into this process.
So much, Qasim, and it's such an open and transparent process, and we are required to respond to each
Such
comment,
an open
and transparent process,
and
not all comments result in changes to the tour, but many of them do, and so we make adjustments to that document with the point of making that document better, as complete as possible, and satisfying as broad a group of people as possible in terms of what they would like to see in the environmental or in the environmental assessment. So I think it's time, Qasim, for a musical interlude. But before we do that, I'll remind our listeners of our toll-free number. It's 1-844-424-0500. You can call or text us at that number. That's 1-844-424-0500. So I thought today we could listen to some bluesy rock music. I don't know what inspired me to do that, Qasim. It's just what happens to appear in my head, I guess, on Wednesdays, I suppose. So I thought today we might listen to a band called Bad Company, and they've been around for a long time. I don't even know if they're still around, but I thought we'd start off with listening to a song called Shooting Star. So if our tech team can bring that up, we will listen to Shooting Star. They're digging deep into the archives.
We got it done.
Oh, they have it. Look at how quick they are. So let's listen to Shooting Star, and then we'll come back, and Qasim and I will continue our conversation on the proposed tour.
Johnny was a schoolboy when he heard his first Beatles song. Love me do, I think it was, and from there it didn't take him long. Got himself a guitar, used to play every night. Now he's in a rock and roll outfit, and everything's alright. Don't you know? Johnny told his mama, hey mama, I'm going away. I'm gonna hit the big time, gonna be a big star someday, yeah. Mama came to the door with a teardrop in her eye. Johnny said, don't cry, mama, smiled and waved goodbye. Don't you know, yeah, yeah. Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Don't you know? Don't you know? Don't you know that you are a shooting star? And all the world will love you just as long as you are. Johnny made a record, went straight up to number one. Suddenly everyone loved to hear him sing a song. Watching the world go by, surprising it goes so fast. Johnny looked around him and said, well, I made the big time at last. Don't you know? Don't you know? Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Don't you know? Whoa, yeah. Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Yeah. And all the world will love you just as long as you are a shooting star. just as long as you are. Johnny died one night, died in his bed. Bottle of whiskey, sleeping tablets by his head. Johnny's life passed him by like a warm summer day. If you listen to the wind, you can still hear him play. Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Don't you know? Don't you know? Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Don't you know? Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Don't you, don't you, don't you, don't you, don't you know? Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Don't you know that you are a shooting star? Don't you know? No, 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 no. No, 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 no,
Okay, we are back. Hope everyone enjoyed Bad Company. And Qasim, I was telling our tech team prior to the start of the show that Bad Company is actually good company.
I think everyone got to realize that, Don, just now.
Okay, so let's now look at the contents of the proposed tour by going through the component sections. So there's a number of sections that make up the proposed tour, and we're only going to cover 3 of them today. But just to give our listeners sort of the full picture of what is in this document, let's just run through them here. So we have the introduction section, and again, we're going to break down each of these in more detail. We have the description of and rationale for alternatives. So uh, that's a very important section because project alternatives have to be evaluated properly in terms of so to develop the preferred alternative. There's another important and big section, which is the description of the project, which has a lot of detail in it, which we'll get into later today. We have consultation and engagement. We have indigenous knowledge, another key component of the proposed tour. Assessment methods, how that impact or environmental assessment will actually be undertaken technically. Environmental effects assessment, climate change assessment, commitments and monitoring. So what's the commitments related to the project, the follow-up monitoring to ensure that that the impacts are nothing outside of what may have been expected, if at all. And then finally, the flexibility to accommodate to new circumstances. That's another key part of the proposed tour. So, Qasim, maybe let's look at the first key component of the proposed tour, and that's the introduction section.
Yeah, so the introduction section, of course, that's where the proposed tour begins. And it is really the introductory section for the overall project and the process. So that's the big difference. It doesn't just
Yes.
describe the project; it also describes the process. So it's got a couple of key components. The first one is an explanation of the purpose of the document. in the context of the regulatory process. So where does this document sit vis-a-vis the overall regulatory process? So the proposed store is retrospective. It's sort of introspective, really. It looks into why this document exists and where it exists within the overall process. It provides an understanding of the project, what the project is, identification of the proponent, in this case, proponents, joint proponents of Martin Falls First Nation and Webakwe First Nation. It provides a background and context of the project, previous studies that might have been done, different work that was conducted, and what that might have said at a high level. Purpose of and rationale for the project. Why is the project which is under discussion, why is it required? And then, in addition to the project itself, why is this environmental assessment required? What's the purpose of this environmental assessment that's described? And then lastly, the regulatory framework of the EA and IA, as well as the anticipated permits required. So this entire document, of course, is a public document, not just for the federal or provincial regulators, anyone interested in the proposed store once it becomes available. Again, in the next sort of 4 to 5 weeks, we'll provide an exact date at the next show. Once it becomes available, you can go download it from our website directly, the Northern Road Link website. And if you're just curious, if you have comments, or even if you don't, it is available for anyone to have a look at and to provide comments on as well.
Thanks, Qasim. And this is a technical document, but it's relatively accessible to the average reader, and it will be accompanied by a plain language executive summary as well too. So it's I can say, I mean, I have expertise in certain areas, but as a reader, generally these are not too difficult to follow. Even in some of the technical sections, they're usually quite well explained. So I don't think our listeners should be concerned about having a look at a document like this, because I think it's and if they have questions, they can certainly find the answers to those questions by contacting us as well, and we can help guide them and explain things as best we can. The next section of the proposed tour is the description of and rationale for alternatives. So the first part of this is what we call the alternatives to. So instead of what's being proposed, what other methods could be used? So um, the one that's always present is what's called the do nothing alternative. And the purpose of the do nothing alternative, which is basically keeping the status quo, keeping the current situation without developing a project, the specific project. And the purpose of it is to provide a benchmark, so a point of comparison against which other alternatives can be prepared. So that's what the do nothing alternative to actually is. And in our particular case, there are no other alternatives to other than do nothing, to assess, because that work has been done previously. There other alternatives too were discussed and assessed as part of a number of previous studies that have been undertaken. So maybe, Qasim, you can go through another of the key parts of the alternative section, and that's the alternative methods. And there's quite a bit to this, isn't there?
Yes, there is. So you talked about you talked about one alternative section in the proposed tour, Don, which is alternatives to. Now
Yes.
there's another section which is called alternative methods. That's just the different ways in which you could do the task at hand. And the task at hand, even though if you sort of zoom out, it is a single road, but there's so many different components of a road. as I'm sure everyone can imagine. So if you sort of take this to your mind's eye, a road is sort of a linear infrastructure on the ground, and then it's an amalgamation of bridges, culverts, and other structures. The rails on the side, the shoulders, and then it's serviced or brought into existence through service infrastructure. Now, these are many different ways in which a road can be built. So that section, the alternative method section, describes all of that. So it tells us about alternative road corridors that might be possible, alternative sites for temporary and permanent aggregate extraction pits and production facilities, access roads that might be required for construction and operation of the road, alternative sites for supporting infrastructure required during construction, like construction camps. It talks about watercourse crossing structure types, culverts and bridges, and within that, the span length, the life cycle. It talks about construction staging methods, particularly at water body crossings, hydrogeological and aquatic environments, and long term maintenance of the project. Sort of describes road attributes. So if you think of the different attributes of the road, it will describe things like the roadbed foundation, the horizontal alignment, if you think about horizontal and vertical, the road sort of does both. It goes straight on a horizontal plane, and the proposed tour describes that. But then it describes the vertical alignment, which means the changes in elevation of the road, the profile of the overall road, and adjustments to the cross section, the right of way width of the corridor. So all of those different elements of what can potentially make that zoomed out road overall, they're all sort of discussed and contemplated here. Construction timing, again, lastly, things that can be done in certain season and can't be done in certain seasons. Those are also discussed. So these together describe the alternative methods of doing things. As you can imagine, there's probably countless permutations of how you could do things, and then it really becomes the job of the overall study, and the feedback we receive from neighbors and communities, indigenous communities, from regulators, general public, that really helps us shape decisions towards eventually what emerges as the preferred.
It's so true, Qasim. There are, like you said, many permutations and combinations here because you've got so many different infrastructure elements and then attributes of the infrastructure, like as you mentioned, attributes of the road, the thickness of the roadbed during through different terrain types changes, and it can change. So it's a bit of a puzzle, going through this and trying to figure out exactly what goes where, which option is selected. I mean, even things like, when you have aggregate pits or quarries, the access roads to get to those locations, where to put them to limit any impacts, and then those access roads cross water courses. So even for temporary facilities, this is a bit of a bit of a puzzle as well too. So there's an awful lot to this alternative methods section, and then I guess as part of that too, Qasim, there's the background, looking at previous studies too, isn't there? Slide number 9 there.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's looking at the background, the previous studies that have been done, how things came into shape. What's been the historical thinking around doing this project? If anyone's spent the time doing something like this, and for many projects, most projects aren't, especially at the stage we're at, which is you're now sort of thinking about the potential possibility of building a road. It's typically been around for a while. Like, people have thought of it and sort of discussed it in some shape or form, And many times for something as major as this project, people might have done initial studies and might have put heads together to think about what this means. And governments might have sort of thought about what this means for the overall provincial infrastructure plan, for example. So all of that background typically is available on a project of this sort.
Yes, and there has to be sort of a demonstrated and traceable path of evolution of these alternatives towards a preferred alternative as well, too. So that those kinds of discussions can get quite complicated because they've occurred over a number of years through other studies, quite often, as you mentioned. So, and that's this project is no exception, as well. So we will continue our discussion on that. I just wanted to remind our listeners to call or text us at 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. I think we're ready for our second song of the day by Bad Company, which is Good Company. And I thought we'll go with a song which is actually the name of the band. Imagine that. And it's called Bad Company. So let's listen to Bad Company. Then we'll come back and continue our conversation.
Queued up, Don.
Does our team have it? They have that ready? Okay. Let's listen to Bad Company.
Company, always on the run. Destiny is a rising sun. Oh, I was born, six gun in my hand. Behind a gun, I'll make my final stand. Hey, that's why they call me Bad Company, and I can't deny Bad Company till the day I die. Till the day I die. Till the day I die. Rebel souls, deserters we are called. Chose a gun and threw away the sword. Now these towns, they all know our name. Six gun sound is our claim to fame. I can hear them say, Bad Company, and I won't deny. Bad Company, till the day I die. Yeah.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're now ready to move on to the next component of the proposed tour, which is the description of the project. And this is a pretty critical section, and it's usually quite a lengthy section because the expectation is that there be quite a bit of content in here and a lot of detail. And you'll see as we start to go through what is typically included in a section like this. The purpose of it is to really sort of paint that picture for the reader as to what the project involves. And as Qasim talked about earlier, even though it's an all-season road, a road is not just a road. There's the supporting infrastructure associated with it, the temporary infrastructure, whether it's access roads to get to gravel pits and quarries, it's lay down areas, it's storage areas, it's construction camps. There's a lot to a project like this, some temporary, again, some permanent, but and so that needs to be to the greatest degree possible laid out for the reader so that they can truly understand what's involved in it, and that so that the proponent can demonstrate clearly to the public that what this project is about, and provide that information. So the first part of that is just the setting, is just providing a geographic setting. Where is this project? And where does it sit within the context of other projects? In our case, there were two other large projects, both all-season roads that are occurring in the same area. There's the Webequay Supply Road and there's the Martin Falls Community Access Road. So it's really important to sort of develop that setting for the reader so that when they're moving through the technical information, they can put it in that context, in that geographic context. So that's a pretty important section there, just to get that set up. And Qasim, there's another big section that I think we should spend quite a bit of time on, and that's the the design considerations and criteria. There's a lot to this, more than maybe people think on the surface, because there's a lot of details, a lot of attributes, a lot of considerations from the design perspective, especially for a road like this, which runs through a very complex landscape. It's got some very sensitive areas. So maybe you can run through these for our listeners, Qasim.
This is probably one of there are many important parts of the tour, but certainly a lot of detail in this section, Don. And I think from the perspective of being able to visualize the project, this is probably the section that people want to pay a little bit of attention to, because it describes what the road's going to look like eventually. The description of the project, design consideration and criteria. This section includes almost all elements of a road design, which, as we've sort of touched upon, are really quite astonishing. How many different pieces go on to make a road of this sort? And when you sort of zoom out, a road's a road's a road. But when you really zoom in, particularly in a terrain like this, and given the length of this road, like the Northern Road Link, there are many different things that one has to consider. So let's start with the first part, which is the structure types. What type of structures would this road include? What would be the span length of those structures? What type of a life cycle would they have? When would they be commissioned, and when would they have to be decommissioned? Construction staging methods at water body crossings would have to be considered as well. And construction staging and construction at the water body requires a little bit more thoughtfulness, and it's a longer process than your average road construction. So that's why so much thought and design goes into that. Then you've got road attributes. I talked about horizontal alignment, which is the straight sections and the curves. So think about sort of a horizontal plane, and now the road goes straight on a horizontal plane, but it also curves, sideways. At times, curves quite a bit. And from a design perspective and a safety perspective, you want those curves to be gentle and nice, so people can follow the speed limit off the road and still drive in a safe way. So those are considerations. Those are some real considerations that go in. Then you've got the vertical alignment, which is again the elevation and profile of the road. Some slopes can be really steep on roads, and reducing that slope becomes a priority from a safety and drivability perspective as well. So those things you really sort of dig deep into finding solutions that make sense from many different criteria and dimensions. Then you look at adjustments to the cross section and the right of way width of the corridor. Now, the right of width way means that it's the overall right of way is the overall area that you might come to clear for the road. But how large should the shoulders be? There are many different ways, and shoulder lengths can be determined. A larger shoulder next to the road means a longer line of sight. So if there are animals lurking in the trees, as much as we want them to be safe, we know that every now and then they can run onto the highway, and that's a hazard, safety hazard. So designing shoulders which allow a driver to be able to see animals coming in, that adds to safety. So you want to consider those things based on all the information and data that you've got. Then you look at alternative sites for supportive infrastructure. You're making the road once, but you're maintaining it forever. So you might have temporary laydown and storage areas and construction camps, but you'll have long-term infrastructure associated with the road to maintain it. Service roads that go to aggregate sites, some of those would be temporary for construction, others would be permanent for operations in the future. Construction timing, seasonality, again, becomes a key factor, especially in a climate like the climate around the Northern Road Link. Staging along the right of way to minimize potential effects on the natural environment and traditional indigenous land and resource use. So you want to be absolutely critically mindful of that as any project, but more so for us, maybe Don, as an
Yes.
indigenous proponent, and really get those marching orders from Martin Falls and Webber to not only be mindful of those realities, but to put them at the forefront. And so, for example, close to the hunting period, will sort of pause or steer clear of the areas in which that traditional spring hunt is planned for, which is just coming up. But based on this week's forecast, it might be delayed a little bit there, Don. I think. Uh,
That's right.
yeah, yeah. So now, then, apart from that, you've got considerations of annual average daily traffic volumes. So that's just a slightly more difficult way of saying that how much traffic do you expect on a daily basis on average, based on yearly numbers, and the amount of traffic you're getting dictates the design of the overall road. If you're going to get a lot more traffic, you want the road to be able to withstand all the force of the use at the wear and tear that higher level of traffic is going to bring. But if you don't anticipate a lot of traffic, you can build a road which doesn't need to bear all that wear and tear. Then design speed versus the posted speed. Uh, the posted speed on a road like this, let's say, might be about 80 kilometers an hour, but their design speed would be slightly higher, just to provide that safety cushion as well. Road surface type: do we pave it? Do we leave it as a gravel road? And there are many good reasons to leave it as a gravel road in a northern region like the Northern Road Link study area. design flow for ditches, culverts, culvert diameters, road elevation and profile. So there's so many other subcomponents, Don, which I
Yes.
guess you and I just didn't talk about, but our engineering team really gets to wrestle with all of that in the background there, eh?
It's so true, Qasim. There's just a lot of details or variables to consider in the design considerations and criteria section, and in many cases, not all the details are sorted out. Some of the details are sorted out at later stages, sometimes at detailed design of the road. But you have to demonstrate, to the best of the team has to demonstrate, the proponent's team has to demonstrate to the best of its sort of knowledge what they think are going to be, the details associated with this. And then as the work progresses, there'll be refinements, maybe in culvert diameters, maybe in, depth of ditches in certain areas, and as opposed to other areas based on information that's being collected on terrain type. Maybe road elevations are different through the muskeg versus in other areas that are better drained. So there's there's a lot of considerations in this section, and I think, Qasim, we're ready for one final song. But before we go to that, let me just remind our listeners to call or text us at 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. We will come back in a minute to finish off our discussion on the proposed tour. But next, I think let's listen to a song called Live for the Music, again by Bad Company. So if our tech team can bring that up,
You
Live
got it,
for the
Don.
Music. They have it. Let's listen to Live for the Music, and then we'll come back and finish our conversation on the proposed tour.
Some people say I'm no good, laying in my bed all day. But when the nighttime comes, I'm ready to rock and roll my toes away. I don't care if the sun don't shine, I know I'm gonna see it through. I don't care what nobody says, I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna live for the music, give it everything you got. Live for the music, you know you're gonna find a lot to ease your mind. Now you may say I'm a mean mistreater, say I never treat you right, but sooner or later I'm gonna get to you, baby. I don't wanna fuss and fight. Hey, baby, give me good.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our conversation on the proposed tour by now continuing to talk about the description of the project, but this time project components and related activities. So when we're talking about project components, we're talking about uh, the components and the attributes of those components. So in this case, the length of the road, the width of the right-of-way, the reserved area for the road. That's probably the best way to describe it. The cleared area, the actual area that's cleared of vegetation for the road to go through. And then the actual width of the road, the shoulders and the area that's covered with surface material, so the road surface material, as well as ditches or shoulders, depending on where you are and if there are ditches and so there. It also includes the water crossings, bridges, and culverts, and we've talked about this before. Then you've got the actual water crossing structures, but you've also got these culverts, and the culverts aren't always there just to cross water courses, but they're also included in particular areas to ensure that there's what you call a water level balance. So, and to allow the flow of water, the proper flow of water, because you don't want it building up on one side of the road and potentially flooding the road and causing more lasting damage to the road. So, through areas such as the muskeg, and we've talked about this before in previous presentations, you might include more culverts to ensure the flow of water so that there isn't this sort of unequal flow from one side to the other. And then the other project components are the ones that we talked about earlier, where beyond just the road, you have these what you call ancillary structures or uh, other sort of supportive infrastructure that's there to support the road, either its construction or its maintenance. And these would include things like borrow areas. Borrow areas are areas where you would remove soil, excavate soil or other subsurface material and use that to help with the road. It might be to stabilize a slope along the road for different reasons or to fill certain areas that might be low. So you have borrow areas, you have aggregate sources. Aggregate would be the material like the finer material like gravel that's used as a road base, and then quarry sites where in the absence of enough aggregate material you would have larger rock material, which could then be crushed to create gravel, or it could be used to protect culverts from erosion as well. There would also be temporary access roads or temporary water crossings to get to these sort of this supportive infrastructure, work and laydown areas, construction camps, all these parts are actual project components. They're part of the project. So um, again, there's a lot of detail in this section as well too. And I mean the purpose of this description of the project section is to provide as much detail as possible, knowing that maybe some things might change slightly, but provide as much detail as possible to allow those reading it and evaluating it, the give them as much detail as they can to make an informed decision as to whether it's sufficient to proceed with the environmental assessment. So there's a lot to that, and Qasim, maybe you can briefly talk about the next section, which is project activities and schedule.
Yes, absolutely, Don. And in terms of the activities, the project activities sort of are broken down by different phases of the project. So once the project begins, of course, the first part after the environmental assessment, that is, the first part is construction. So this section describes road construction, construction of the infrastructure that's required to support the construction effort, emissions, discharges, and waste associated with construction itself. So the construction life cycle has its own emissions, its own discharges, and potential for waste, which is very different from the operational phase. So that's why this is specifically discussed in the construction section. Then we talk about the operation phase, in which road operations and maintenance are discussed overall. Again, there's a discussion on emissions, discharges, and potential waste associated with the project. And lastly, the project schedule is discussed at a relatively high level at this stage, because it's still something that's being refined and worked on in the background. And as that information becomes more refined and granular, that information becomes available as well. So these are the two main activities of the project: construction and operations. Decommissioning would be discussed in some projects, but in terms of the Northern Road Link, we don't anticipate decommissioning in the future. This is anticipated to be sort of a permanent piece of infrastructure in Northern Ontario. So for us, it's really a discussion about construction and the operations phase. And lastly, Don, as I've said, the project schedule.
Thank you, Qasim. Lot to cover in a short period of time, and we do have a number of other sections to cover in our next session on the proposed tour 2 weeks from now. We'll be talking about consultation and engagement, Indigenous knowledge, assessment methods, environmental effects assessment, climate change assessment, commitments and monitoring, and flexibility to accommodate new circumstances. So lots more to talk about, and it hopefully this will give our listeners a pretty good idea of what to expect in the proposed tour. So, Qasim, that wraps up today's discussion. Thank you, as always, for sharing your thoughts in this first part of the proposed tour discussion. I hope our viewers and listeners are beginning to have a clearer idea of exactly what's in the proposed, or what's going to be in the proposed tour document. Join us again in 2 weeks when we're going to continue our discussion of the contents of the proposed tour. And please don't forget to visit our website at northernroadlink.ca, or follow us on social media at NRL Roadlink. So thanks again to everyone for listening. Thank you, Qasim, for joining me in this, and we will talk to you again in 2 weeks. Miigwech.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Don.